Los Angeles. Summer 1985. The city looked normal from a distance. Traffic moved through crowded freeways. Families gathered for dinner. Children played outside until sunset. Television sets glowed behind apartment windows. Life continued exactly as it always had. But beneath that normal routine, something was changing. Slowly, quietly, and almost nobody realized it at first. Because fear doesn't always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it enters a city one neighborhood at a time, one headline at a time, one unanswered question at a time, until eventually an entire population begins looking over its shoulder. And by the summer of 1984, millions of people across Southern California were doing exactly that. Not because of a war, not because of a natural disaster, but because somewhere in the darkness, a predator was moving through the city, and nobody knew who he was. What made the situation uniquely terrifying wasn't simply the number of crimes being investigated. It was the unpredictability. Investigators couldn't identify a clear pattern. The victims didn't seem connected. The locations varied, the circumstances changed. There was no obvious explanation tying everything together. And that uncertainty created something far more powerful than panic. It created vulnerability. People didn't know who might be targeted next, they didn't know where, they didn't know when, and perhaps most disturbing of all, they didn't know why. Today, many people know the name Richard Ramirez. They know the nickname that newspapers eventually gave him, the Night Stalker. But in the early stages of the investigation, detectives weren't chasing a famous serial offender. They were chasing fragments, pieces of evidence scattered across a rapidly growing collection of cases. At first glance, many investigators didn't even realize they were looking at the same individual, different crime scenes, different victims, different circumstances. The connections weren't immediately obvious, and that delay would become one of the most important elements of the entire story. Because every day that investigators struggled to connect the dots was another day a dangerous offender remained unidentified. To understand why this case became one of the most infamous criminal investigations in American history, it's important to understand California during the mid 1980s. Southern California was growing rapidly. Los Angeles County alone contained millions of residents spread across enormous distances. Dozens of cities blended together. Neighborhoods stretched endlessly. Law enforcement agencies often worked separate jurisdictions. Information sharing wasn't always as seamless as it would become decades later. In other words, the environment itself created challenges. A person capable of moving between neighborhoods, cities, and counties could create confusion simply through mobility. And confusion is exactly what investigators were facing. Meanwhile, the public knew very little. Most residents saw isolated news reports, a crime here, another incident there, an investigation still ongoing. Many people assumed these events were unrelated. After all, terrible crimes occur in large cities every year. Most don't turn out to be part of a larger pattern. But behind the scenes, detectives were beginning to notice troubling similarities. Not enough for certainty, not enough for public warnings, but enough to create concern. Evidence from separate investigations was starting to point in the same direction, and as more information arrived, that concern grew. One of the most important aspects of this case is often overlooked. The fear didn't appear overnight. Popular culture sometimes portrays major criminal investigations as sudden moments of chaos. A dramatic event occurs, the public instantly panics. Authorities launch massive operations. Reality is usually different. Fear develops gradually. People begin hearing stories. Neighbors talk. News coverage expands. Questions multiply. And eventually, a community realizes something larger may be happening. That's exactly what occurred throughout Southern California. By the middle of 1985, many residents had started changing routines. Doors were checked twice, windows were locked more carefully, families discussed safety more frequently. People who had never worried about crime before suddenly paid attention to local news broadcasts. The atmosphere was changing. and journalists were beginning to notice. Television stations devoted increasing attention to the investigation. Newspapers expanded coverage. Reporters searched for answers. But answers were difficult to find because detectives themselves were still assembling the puzzle. What they knew for certain was limited. What they suspected was growing. And the gap between those two realities created enormous pressure. Pressure on investigators, pressure on political leaders, pressure on the media, and eventually pressure on the public itself. Yet, despite all the uncertainty, one thing slowly became clear. Whoever was responsible appeared remarkably difficult to predict. Most criminal investigations rely on patterns. Patterns help investigators narrow possibilities. Patterns help identify motives. Patterns help forecast future behavior. But this offender seemed determined to break expectations. And every time investigators thought they understood the situation, new information complicated the picture. That unpredictability became one of the defining characteristics of the case, not simply because it challenged detectives, but because it challenged ordinary people. People want to believe danger follows rules, that threats can be identified, avoided, understood. The Night Stalker investigation challenged those assumptions, and that challenge created an atmosphere unlike anything Southern California had experienced in years. As the summer continued, detectives worked longer hours, evidence accumulated, witness descriptions were analyzed, leads were pursued, mistakes were corrected, connections were explored. Behind every development was the same urgent question: who was responsible? At that stage, nobody knew the answer, not the public, not the media, not even the investigators leading the case. All they knew was that somewhere in Southern California, an unidentified offender was continuing to operate, and every passing day increased the stakes. Because the longer the mystery remained unsolved, the more fear spread. The city didn't know it yet, but it was about to become the center of one of the most intense manhunts in American criminal history, a case that would dominate headlines, challenge investigators, captivate the nation, and permanently change how millions of people thought about safety, fear, and the power of public awareness. The story of the Night Stalker had not yet reached its most famous chapters. The name itself hadn't fully entered public consciousness. The face remained unknown, the identity remained hidden, but the foundation of the mystery was already in place. And somewhere beyond the glow of television screens and city street lights, the investigation was beginning to close in. Every major investigation begins with uncertainty. Detectives rarely start with a complete picture. Instead, they begin with fragments: a witness statement, a piece of physical evidence, a timeline that doesn't quite make sense. Then, slowly, piece by piece, a larger story begins to emerge. In the Night Stalker investigation, that process was unusually difficult because at first there didn't appear to be a clear story at all. The incidents being investigated across Southern California seemed disconnected. Different neighborhoods, different circumstances, different victims, different methods of entry. Nothing obvious connected them, and yet experienced investigators kept encountering details that felt strangely familiar, not enough to draw conclusions, but enough to raise questions. Questions that would eventually lead to one of the most significant breakthroughs in the case. By the spring of 1985, law enforcement agencies throughout Southern California were dealing with increasing pressure. Certain crimes were attracting public attention. News reports were becoming more frequent. Community concern was growing, and investigators were starting to realize they might not be looking at isolated events. One of the reasons this case became so challenging was the absence of a predictable victim profile. In many criminal investigations, detectives search for common characteristics: age, occupation, lifestyle, relationships, geographic patterns. These similarities often provide valuable clues. But this case refused to cooperate. The victims appeared remarkably different from one another. Some were elderly, others were much younger. Some lived alone, others lived with family members. Some lived in urban areas, others lived in quieter residential neighborhoods. There was no simple category that explained why these individuals had been targeted, and that lack of consistency created enormous investigative problems. Because if investigators couldn't determine who might be at risk, they also struggled to predict where the offender might appear next. As more reports were reviewed, detectives began focusing on behavioral patterns rather than victim characteristics. Instead of asking who was being targeted, they started asking how incidents were occurring. That shift in perspective would prove critical. Certain similarities began standing out: the timing, the locations, methods of entry, evidence left behind, witness descriptions. Individually, these details didn't seem extraordinary. Together, they suggested something much larger. Some investigators became increasingly convinced that a single offender might be responsible. Others remained cautious. After all, linking unrelated cases too quickly can create serious mistakes. Evidence had to support the theory. Assumptions weren't enough, so detectives continued gathering information patiently, methodically, carefully. Meanwhile, public concern continued increasing. Television stations expanded their coverage. Newspapers published additional reports. Conversations about safety became more common throughout Southern California. People who had previously paid little attention to crime news suddenly began following investigations closely. And with every new report, anxiety spread a little further. Yet most residents still didn't understand the full scope of what investigators were confronting. They saw individual incidents. Detectives were beginning to see a pattern. One of the most valuable tools available to investigators was witness testimony. Although eyewitness accounts are never perfect, they can provide important leads when combined with physical evidence. In several cases, survivors and witnesses describe similar characteristics: a lean male figure, dark hair, a quiet presence, someone who appeared comfortable moving through residential areas unnoticed. No single description solved the case, but together they helped investigators narrow possibilities. Another important development in evidence technology in the mid 1980s was far more limited than it is today. There were no modern DNA databases, no advanced digital surveillance networks, no instant information sharing systems connecting every jurisdiction. Investigators relied heavily on fingerprints, ballistics, shoe impressions, and traditional detective work. Every piece of evidence mattered, every detail required careful examination, and in this case, those details were beginning to align. Slowly but unmistakably, behind the scenes, task forces expanded cooperation. Information flowed between agencies more frequently. Detectives compared reports, reviewed evidence, examined timelines. The possibility of a serial offender became increasingly difficult to ignore. Still, uncertainty remained. Investigators knew they were dealing with someone who appeared adaptable, someone who didn't follow expectations, someone capable of changing behavior when necessary. That flexibility made the offender particularly difficult to track. Many criminals repeat predictable routines. Predictability creates opportunities for arrest. The Night Stalker case seemed different. The offender's actions often appeared opportunistic rather than rigidly structured, and that unpredictability complicated every aspect of the investigation. As weeks passed, another challenge emerged: media attention. Public awareness can be both helpful and harmful during major investigations. On one hand, publicity generates tips, witnesses come forward, communities become more alert, potential leads emerge. On the other hand, widespread coverage can create misinformation, false reports, and public panic. Investigators now faced both realities simultaneously. Phone lines received increasing numbers of calls. Some tips proved useful, many did not. Sorting through information became a major task in itself. Yet, despite these complications, momentum was building. Detectives were no longer examining isolated incidents, they were constructing a profile, not necessarily a psychological profile in the modern television sense, but a behavioral picture. A picture of someone increasingly dangerous, increasingly confident, and increasingly difficult to stop. The pressure on investigators intensified with every passing week. because the stakes were changing. This was no longer simply a collection of separate cases. The possibility of an active serial offender transformed the situation entirely. But the question wasn't just who committed previous crimes, the question became whether future crimes could be prevented, and that responsibility weighed heavily on everyone involved. Experienced detectives later described the investigation as a race against time, not because they knew exactly where the offender would strike next, but because they knew the consequences of delay. Every day without identification created new risks. Every missed lead mattered. Every mistake carried potential consequences, and yet, despite enormous effort, the offender remained invisible. No name, no photograph, no confirmed identity, only evidence, fragments, patterns, and a growing realization that Southern California was facing a threat far larger than anyone initially imagined. The public still didn't know the face, the media still lacked the full story. But inside investigation rooms throughout the region, a troubling conclusion was becoming impossible to avoid. The crimes were connected. The offender was real, and somewhere beyond the reach of detectives, he was still moving freely. For investigators, that realization changed everything. Because once a pattern becomes visible, the clock starts ticking. And in the Night Stalker case, time was becoming increasingly precious. Every major investigation eventually reaches a turning point, a moment when the focus shifts, a moment when detectives stop asking whether crimes are connected and begin asking a far more urgent question: who is responsible? By the summer of 1984, investigators working across Southern California had largely moved beyond the question of connection. The evidence was becoming too difficult to ignore. Patterns existed. Witness accounts shared similarities. Physical evidence pointed toward a single offender. Now the challenge was identification, and that challenge would prove extraordinarily difficult because despite months of investigation, the person responsible remained almost invisible. No confirmed name, no photograph, no arrest record that immediately solved the puzzle. Nothing investigators could easily use to place a face on the growing collection of evidence, yet the pressure to find that face was increasing every day, not only within law enforcement, but throughout California itself. The atmosphere across Southern California had begun to change dramatically. People who normally left windows open at night no longer did so. Neighborhood watch groups expanded. Hardware stores reported increased sales of locks, alarms, and security equipment. Families discussed safety plans. Friends checked on elderly relatives more frequently. Even people who lived far from reported incidents felt affected. That was one of the most remarkable aspects of the Night Stalker case. Fear spread far beyond individual crime scenes because uncertainty travels quickly, and uncertainty was everywhere. Residents didn't know who the offender was, they didn't know where he lived, they didn't know where he might appear next, and perhaps most unsettling of all, they didn't know what kind of person they were looking for. Could he be a stranger passing through neighborhoods, a local resident, someone employed nearby, someone blending into ordinary daily life? Without answers, imagination filled the gaps, and imagination often creates fears larger than reality itself. Meanwhile, investigators worked relentlessly behind the scenes. Hundreds of leads poured into law enforcement agencies. Telephone calls arrived daily. Witness reports were reviewed. Potential suspects were examined and eliminated. Teams compared evidence from different jurisdictions. The workload became enormous. Yet detectives understood something important. Cases like this are rarely solved by luck alone. They are solved through persistence, the careful accumulation of small details, one clue connected to another, one report supporting another, one piece of evidence leading to the next. And eventually, that process began producing results. One of the most valuable developments involved forensic evidence. Today, audiences are accustomed to seeing advanced technology solve cases quickly in television dramas. Reality is much slower, especially during the mid 1980s. Investigators relied heavily on fingerprints, physical evidence, witness statements, and patient detective work. Every recovered clue mattered, every preserved detail mattered, And in this investigation, detectives were beginning to realize that seemingly minor evidence might become the key to everything. At the same time, journalists continued covering developments aggressively. News broadcasts devoted increasing attention to the case. Newspaper headlines appeared almost daily. Public demand for answers intensified. The media needed information, investigators needed time. Those two needs didn't always align perfectly. Law enforcement agencies faced a difficult balancing act, provide too little information, and the public becomes frustrated. Provide too much information, and the offender gains insight into the investigation. Every public statement required careful consideration, every announcement carried consequences. Yet, despite those challenges, awareness continued growing. The case had evolved beyond a local investigation. It was becoming a regional story, and soon it would become a national one. One reason the story attracted such intense attention was the offender's unpredictability. People naturally seek patterns. Patterns provide comfort, they create the illusion of control. If danger follows rules, people believe they can avoid it. But the Night Stalker investigation challenged that assumption repeatedly. The victims appeared different from one another. The locations varied, the circumstances changed. This unpredictability made the case feel unusually personal to many residents. People couldn't easily convince themselves they were outside the risk zone. And that emotional reality helped explain why public concern continued growing. Detectives faced another challenge as well. The offender appeared increasingly confident. Many investigators later noted that serial offenders sometimes become more difficult to stop when they believe they are avoiding detection successfully. Confidence can influence behavior, decision making, risk taking. The longer an offender remains unidentified, the more comfortable they may become. That possibility worried investigators deeply because every successful evasion represented another opportunity for future crimes. The race was becoming increasingly urgent. Then came one of the most important realizations of the entire investigation. The breakthrough wasn't likely to come from a dramatic confession or a lucky witness suddenly identifying a stranger. It would come from evidence, carefully collected, carefully preserved, carefully analyzed. This realization reinforced the importance of traditional investigative work. Detectives revisited reports, reviewed timelines, compared physical evidence, examined every available lead. Nothing could be overlooked, nothing could be dismissed prematurely, because somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports and evidence, the answer already existed. They simply hadn't found it yet. As summer progressed, the case entered a new phase. The manhunt was no longer abstract. Investigators weren't merely studying an unknown offender, they were actively moving closer to identification, slowly, methodically, but undeniably. The distance between evidence and identity was shrinking. And while the public couldn't see it yet, important pieces were beginning to fall into place. Some of the most critical clues in the case were already sitting inside evidence rooms, waiting, not dramatic enough for headlines, not obvious enough for television cameras, but powerful enough to eventually change everything. The offender still believed he remained anonymous. He still moved through California without realizing how close investigators were getting. But behind every report, every forensic examination, every late night meeting between detectives, the same reality was emerging. The investigation was gaining momentum, the puzzle was becoming clearer, and for the first time, law enforcement could begin imagining something that had once seemed distant. An actual arrest, a real name, a real face. The question was no longer whether the mystery could be solved. The question was who would find the final piece first, the investigators, or the man they were hunting. For months, investigators had been chasing shadows, witness descriptions, partial evidence, unconfirmed leads, thousands of pieces of information moving in different directions at the same time. The Night Stalker investigation had grown into one of the largest manhunts California had seen in years. But despite the effort, detectives still faced the same fundamental problem. They knew more about the crimes than they did about the person committing them. And until that changed, every breakthrough felt temporary, every lead felt incomplete. Every answer created new questions. Then slowly something began shaping, not because of a dramatic confession, not because of a surprise witness, and not because someone suddenly recognized the offender. The shift came through something much less exciting: evidence. The kind of evidence that rarely appears dramatic in documentaries, the kind that sits quietly inside reports and laboratory files, the kind that only becomes important when investigators connect it correctly. As detectives reviewed crime scenes across Southern California, certain physical clues continued appearing. Individually, they seemed minor. Collectively, they became powerful. Investigators started realizing they weren't just building a profile anymore. They were building a path that could eventually lead to a specific individual. One of the most important aspects of this phase involved patience. Popular crime stories often create the impression that investigations move rapidly. A clue appears, a detective has an insight, the suspect is identified. Reality almost never works that way. Real investigations are slower, messier, filled with dead ends and uncertainty. The Night Stalker case was no exception. Detectives spent countless hours reviewing information that ultimately led nowhere. Potential suspects were investigated and eliminated. Witness accounts were verified. Evidence was re examined. Timelines were adjusted. The process demanded discipline. Because in high pressure cases, there is always a temptation to move too quickly, to assume, to speculate, to convince yourself you have the answer before the evidence fully supports it. Experienced investigators resist that temptation, and in this case, that discipline would prove critical because the breakthrough that eventually emerged wasn't based on instinct, it was based on verification. Meanwhile, public anxiety continued reaching new levels. Television coverage expanded, radio stations discussed developments daily, newspapers competed for information. Every update attracted attention, every rumor spread rapidly. Southern California was no longer simply following a criminal investigation. The region was living through a shared experience, an atmosphere of uncertainty that touched millions of people. The psychological impact became impossible to ignore. People adjusted routines. Families discussed safety more openly. Communities became increasingly alert. In some neighborhoods, residents organized informal patrols. Others exchanged phone numbers with neighbors for the first time. The fear wasn't simply about crime, it was about unpredictability. Because people still didn't know who they were looking for, and uncertainty often feels more threatening than certainty. At the center of all this attention, detectives remained focused on evidence. One particular development began attracting increasing interest. A vehicle connected to the investigation. At first, it seemed like one lead among many, important but not necessarily decisive. However, experienced investigators understood something crucial. Vehicles create opportunities, they connect locations, they create timelines, and most importantly, they sometimes preserve evidence. The possibility that this lead could provide direct forensic value immediately elevated its importance. Teams worked carefully. Information was cross checked, records were examined, every detail mattered because if investigators made a mistake at this stage, they risk losing momentum, and momentum was becoming increasingly valuable. Then came another important realization. The offender's ability to remain anonymous wasn't unlimited. The more attention the case received, the more difficult anonymity became. News coverage had transformed the investigation. Millions of people were now paying attention. Someone somewhere might eventually recognize something: a face, a behavior, a connection, a memory. Public awareness was slowly becoming an investigative tool. That possibility created new optimism among detectives. Not confidence, not certainty, but optimism. For the first time in months, the investigation felt like it was moving toward identification rather than simply documentation. And once identification becomes possible, everything changes. The investigation enters a new phase. Resources shift, strategies evolve, The goal is no longer understanding the offender. The goal becomes finding him. Behind closed doors, task force members continued coordinating information. Meetings became more frequent. Evidence reviews became more detailed. Investigators understood that major cases often reach a tipping point, a moment when months of work suddenly begin producing results. Nobody knew exactly when that moment would arrive, but many detectives could feel it approaching. The pieces were aligning, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to create momentum. And momentum is dangerous for people trying to remain hidden because every new connection reduces anonymity, every verified detail narrows possibilities, every confirmed lead increases pressure. The offender didn't know it yet, but the investigation was becoming increasingly focused. The circle was shrinking, not visibly, not dramatically, but steadily. One clue led to another, one report supported another, one fragment connected to another fragment, and slowly the outline of a real person began emerging from the evidence. Not a nickname, not a newspaper headline, a person, someone with a history, a location, an identity. Detectives were closer than they had ever been. The public still saw a mystery. Investigators were beginning to see a suspect. And somewhere in Southern California, the individual at the center of the manhunt continued moving through everyday life, completely unaware of how much had changed. For months, the investigation had been searching for direction. Now it had something far more valuable, a trail, and once detectives find a trail, they rarely stop following it. Because sometimes the difference between an unsolved mystery and an arrest comes down to a single overlooked detail, a detail that finally forces the unknown to become known. And in the Night Stalker investigation, that moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. Every investigation has a moment when the mystery begins to collapse. Not because every question has been answered, not because the case is solved, but because the unknown finally becomes identifiable. For months, investigators had been pursuing a shadow, a person without a face, a suspect without a name. Evidence existed, witness descriptions existed, patterns existed, but the individual responsible remained hidden behind anonymity. That anonymity was his greatest advantage. As long as investigators didn't know who they were looking for, every lead remained uncertain. Every search remained broad, every strategy remained limited. But by the late summer of 1985, that advantage was beginning to disappear. And it disappeared because of something criminals often underestimate, the power of a small piece of evidence. One of the most important lessons in criminal investigations is that major breakthroughs rarely appear dramatic in real time. People imagine investigators discovering a smoking gun, a confession, a dramatic confrontation. Reality is usually quieter: a fingerprint, a document, a record, a detail that initially seems insignificant, then suddenly everything changes. That was exactly what happened during the Night Stalker investigation. Months of evidence collection had created opportunities. Investigators had preserved physical clues, compared reports, examined forensic findings, and now those efforts were starting to produce results. Among the most important developments was fingerprint analysis. Today, fingerprint identification may sound routine, but during the 1980s, it remained one of the most powerful investigative tools available. Unlike witness memories, fingerprints do not become confused. Unlike rumors, they do not exaggerate. Unlike speculation, they provide direct physical connections. And in this case, investigators possessed fingerprints they believed belonged to the offender. The challenge was determining whose fingerprints they were. That process required patience. Records had to be reviewed, databases examined, comparisons verified, every step needed accuracy, because a mistake at this stage could compromise the entire investigation. Then came the breakthrough. The fingerprints produced a name, not a theory, not a possibility, a name. For the first time, investigators knew who they were searching for: Richard Ramirez. The moment represented a fundamental shift in the investigation. The manhunt was no longer focused on identifying an unknown offender. Now it focused on locating a specific person, The difference changed everything. Investigators could examine background information, past records, known locations, associates, travel patterns. The investigation suddenly became more targeted, more focused, more dangerous for the suspect because anonymity had protected him. Now anonymity was disappearing, yet knowing the name wasn't enough. Ramirez still hadn't been arrested, and that created a new challenge. Law enforcement understood they were racing against time. If the suspect realized the investigators knew his identity, he might flee, he might hide, he might attempt to leave the state. Every hour mattered, every decision mattered. The operation required coordination, and coordination became increasingly difficult because public attention was reaching unprecedented levels. News organizations were aggressively pursuing updates. Journalists understood something significant had happened. Rumors circulated throughout media circles. The investigation appeared to be approaching a major breakthrough, but details remained limited. Investigators faced a difficult question: how much information should be released? Too little information could limit public assistance. Too much information could let the suspect. The balance was delicate, and the consequences were enormous. Meanwhile, Southern California remained on edge. Residents followed every development closely. Many people had spent months wondering whether the mystery would ever be solved, whether the person responsible would ever be identified, whether the fear that had settled over neighborhoods would ever end. Now, for the first time, there was genuine hope. Not certainty, not resolution, but hope. The investigation finally had direction. Yet, one of the most fascinating aspects of this phase involved public awareness. Modern audiences often assume investigations are solved entirely by law enforcement agencies working independently. Reality is often more complicated. Major cases frequently involve cooperation between investigators and communities. Witnesses provide information, citizens notice details, public awareness generates leads. The Night Stalker investigation would soon become one of the most dramatic examples of that reality. Because once Ramirez's image entered public view, something extraordinary happened. Millions of people suddenly knew what investigators had spent months trying to discover. The mystery now had a face, and that face appeared everywhere: television broadcasts, newspapers, news reports, public discussions. The image spread rapidly, almost overnight. For Ramirez, this represented a disaster. For months, he had operated under relative anonymity. Now that anonymity vanished, the same media attention that had helped create fear was now becoming a powerful investigative tool. Every television viewer became a potential witness. Every newspaper reader became a potential source of information. Every person walking through Southern California suddenly knew who authorities were searching for. The psychological impact was enormous, not only for the public, but potentially for the suspect as well. Imagine realizing your photograph has been distributed across an entire region. Imagine understanding that millions of people may recognize you, that every public appearance carries risk, that every encounter becomes unpredictable. The dynamic changes instantly, and investigators knew it. The release of the suspect's image transformed the manhunt. What had once been a search conducted primarily by law enforcement was becoming something larger: a public effort, a regional effort, an entire community focused on a single objective: find the man whose identity had finally been revealed. Yet, despite the breakthrough, danger remained. Identification is not the same as capture. Knowing who a suspect is does not automatically tell investigators where he is. The most difficult phase of many manhunts begins after identification, because now everyone knows who is being pursued, including the person being pursued. That reality created urgency unlike anything investigators had experienced earlier in the case. The mystery of identity had been solved, but the story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just entering its most dramatic chapter. Because somewhere in California, Richard Ramirez was still free, he still had opportunities, he still had choices, and investigators understood one uncomfortable truth: the most dangerous moments in a manhunt often occur right before it ends. The name had finally been discovered. The face had finally been revealed. Now only one question remained: who would find him first, most menaced and quietly? A suspect is located, an arrest is made, a press conference follows. The story moves into the courtroom. The Night Stalker case did not follow that script. Its final chapter on the streets of Los Angeles became one of the most extraordinary moments in American criminal history. Because the person who ultimately stopped Richard Ramirez wasn't a detective studying evidence in an office. It wasn't a specialized task force conducting a covert operation, and it wasn't a carefully planned police raid, it was the public, an entire community that had spent months living under fear. A community that finally recognized the face that had appeared across television screens and newspaper pages. And when that recognition happened, events unfolded with astonishing speed. By late August 1985, Southern California had become deeply familiar with the investigation. The case dominated headlines. News stations covered developments constantly. People discussed the story at work, at school, in restaurants, and inside their homes. The Night Stalker was no longer an unknown figure hidden in police reports. He had become the most wanted person in the region. His image had been distributed widely. Millions of people knew exactly who investigators were searching for. That level of public awareness created something unusual. The manhunt expanded beyond law enforcement. Every neighborhood became part of the search. Every resident became a potential witness, and every public appearance carried enormous risk for the suspect. What happened next illustrates the power of public awareness in a way few criminal cases ever have. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez found himself moving through East Los Angeles. By this point, the publication of his photograph had dramatically altered his circumstances. People recognized him, not because they personally knew him, but because they had seen his image repeatedly in the media. The face had become familiar, and familiarity can be powerful. One person recognized him, then another. Within moments, something remarkable began happening. The man who had spent months avoiding identification suddenly found himself surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was. For investigators, this represented the outcome they had hoped for: public awareness working exactly as intended. For Ramirez, it was a disaster unfolding in real time. Accounts from that day describe confusion, movement through neighborhoods, citizens alerting one another, people reacting almost instantly after recognizing him. The dynamic had completely reversed. For months, the investigation had struggled to find him. Now he was struggling to escape the attention of the public. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the capture is psychological. Fear had dominated Southern California for months. The residents had adjusted routines. Families had worried. Communities had remained alert. But when the opportunity finally arrived, fear transformed into action. The public response wasn't passive. People intervened, people communicated, people helped prevent escape. In many ways, the capture became a symbolic turning point. The city that had spent months feeling vulnerable suddenly reclaimed a sense of control. That emotional shift mattered because major criminal investigations affect communities psychologically. The damage isn't limited to crime scenes. Fear changes behavior. Uncertainty changes behavior. People begin viewing their surroundings differently. The Night Stalker case had produced exactly that effect. And now, for the first time, residents could see the possibility of an ending. As reports of the capture spread, disbelief quickly turned into confirmation. The man at the center of the investigation had been found. After months of headlines, speculation, and fear, the mystery finally had a conclusion, at least partially. Because capture solves one problem, it does not answer every question. Investigators still needed to build their case. Evidence still needed to be organized. Prosecutors still needed to prepare. The legal process was only beginning. But emotionally, something had changed forever. The threat that had haunted Southern California was no longer anonymous, no longer hidden, no longer moving freely through the region. That reality brought enormous relief. News organizations immediately shifted coverage. For months, journalists had asked whether the suspect would ever be identified. Then they asked whether he would ever be captured. Now both questions had answers. Attention turned toward the future, the court proceedings, the evidence, the investigation itself, and perhaps most importantly, the victims and families who had spent months waiting for resolution. One of the reasons the Night Stalker case remains so memorable decades later is because of this unusual ending. Many famous memoirs conclude through investigative breakthroughs alone. The Night Stalker case combined detective work with public awareness in a way that felt almost cinematic. Yet, despite how dramatic the capture appears in retrospect, it was built upon months of meticulous investigation. The fingerprints, the evidence, the witness accounts, the forensic work, the interagency cooperation. Without those elements, the public would never have known who to recognize. Without those elements, the face would never have appeared in newspapers and broadcasts. The capture was dramatic, but it rested upon countless hours of ordinary investigative work. That's an important distinction because successful investigations rarely depend on a single moment. They depend on hundreds of moments working together. As Southern California processed the news, another realization emerged. The case had already become part of history. People would remember where they were when they heard the announcement. They would remember the months of uncertainty, the conversations, the headlines, the fear, and now they would remember the capture. The moment the city finally saw the person who had dominated public attention for so long. Yet, while the public celebrated the end of the manhunt, prosecutors and investigators understood something important. The story was not over. Finding a suspect and proving a case are two different challenges. The manhunt had ended. The courtroom battle was about to begin, and in many ways, that next phase would prove just as significant as everything that came before. Because now the focus would shift from searching for answers to presenting them. The face had been found, the city had fought back, the fear had begun to fade, but the final judgment still lay ahead. When the handcuffs closed, many people believed the story was over. The suspect had been identified. The manhunt had ended. The city could finally breathe again. But major criminal cases rarely end with an arrest. In many ways, that's where the most difficult questions begin because capturing someone answers who, it doesn't always answer why. And as Richard Ramirez entered the courtroom, California found itself confronting a new challenge, understanding the person behind one of the most feared criminal investigations in modern American history. For months, the public had known him only through headlines, through witness descriptions, through police sketches, through television reports. He existed as a mystery, a symbol, a source of fear. Now he was a real person sitting in a courtroom, and that reality felt strangely different. Throughout history, notorious criminal cases often follow a similar pattern. The unknown offender becomes larger than life. People imagine someone almost supernatural, someone impossible to understand. Then an arrest occurs, and suddenly the mystery becomes human. The Night Stalker case followed that pattern exactly. Many people expected to see a monster. Instead, they saw a person whose actions had generated enormous consequences, a person whose decisions had changed how millions of people viewed safety and security, and a person whose future would now be decided through the legal system. The courtroom quickly became the center of national attention. Reporters filled seats, television crews gathered outside, journalists provided daily updates. The case that had dominated headlines during the manhunt continued dominating headlines during prosecution. Every appearance attracted attention, every statement became news. The public fascination remained intense. Yet, beneath the media attention, prosecutors faced a serious responsibility. The goal wasn't simply securing public approval, the goal was presenting evidence, organizing facts, building a case that could withstand scrutiny. That process required extraordinary preparation. By this stage, investigators had accumulated enormous amounts of information, witness accounts, forensic evidence, reports, timelines. documentation collected over months of investigation. Every piece needed careful review, every detail needed verification. Because high profile cases often receive intense examination from both prosecution and defense teams. Nothing can be assumed, everything must be supported. For prosecutors, the challenge wasn't merely proving individual events, it was demonstrating the broader picture, showing jurors how evidence connected, showing how separate pieces fit together, showing why investigators believed they had identified the correct person. That responsibility carried significant weight. Meanwhile, public interest continued growing. Many Americans who had followed the investigation from the beginning now followed the trial with equal attention. For them, the courtroom represented more than a legal process. It represented closure, or at least the possibility of closure. Months of uncertainty had left lasting emotional effects. People wanted answers, they wanted understanding, they wanted the story to make sense. But one of the most difficult realities in criminal cases is that complete understanding is often impossible. Even when investigators solve a case, some questions remain unanswered. Human behavior is complicated, motivations are complicated, and attempts to explain them sometimes create more confusion rather than less. The Night Stalker case highlighted this challenge clearly. Psychologists, journalists, and investigators all attempted to understand how someone could become involved in such behavior. Many examined Ramirez's background, his childhood, his environment, his influences, his personal history. These discussions generated enormous interest. People naturally search for explanations, they want causes, patterns, warnings that might help them understand how such cases develop. Yet, experts frequently caution against oversimplification. There is rarely one explanation, rarely one event, rarely one factor. Human behavior emerges from complex combinations of experiences, choices, circumstances, and individual characteristics. The courtroom became a place where many of these questions surfaced, not necessarily because definitive answers existed, but because people wanted to ask them. At the same time, another important story was unfolding, the story of survivors, families, and communities. Major criminal investigations often focus heavily on offenders, names, photographs, biographies, yet the people most affected by these events frequently receive less attention. The Night Stalker case reminded many observers of that reality. Behind every headline were individuals whose lives had been permanently changed. Families who spent months waiting for developments, communities that lived with uncertainty, people attempting to rebuild normal routines after extraordinary circumstances. For them, the courtroom represented something different. Not fascination, not curiosity, accountability, the opportunity to see evidence examined publicly, the opportunity to watch the legal system perform its function, the opportunity to move forward. Whether complete closure was possible remained another question entirely. As proceedings continued, media coverage expanded beyond California. The case became a national story, not simply because of the investigation itself, but because it reflected larger themes: fear, public awareness, community response, the role of forensic evidence, the challenges of modern law enforcement, and the relationship between media attention and criminal investigations. In many ways, the Night Stalker case became a defining example of its era, an example studied by journalists, investigators, criminologists, and historians, not only because of the crimes involved, but because of how society responded, how investigators adapted, and how communities reacted under pressure. Looking back decades later, one aspect stands out over others. The trial transformed the case from an active threat into a historical event. For months, people asked whether the offender would be found. Now they asked what the case meant, what lessons could be learned, what changes had occurred, how Southern California had been affected. Those questions extended far beyond a single courtroom, and they continue being discussed even today. Because some criminal cases fade quickly from public memory, others become part of history. The Night Stalker case had already crossed that line. The manhunt was over. The evidence was being presented. The nation was watching. And while the legal process continued moving forward, something else was becoming clear. This case would be remembered long after the courtroom lights were turned off, not simply because of what happened, but because of how an entire city responded when fear arrived at his doorstep, long after the arrest, long after the headlines faded, and long after the courtroom proceedings began. Many people still remembered one feeling above all else: fear. Not the kind of fear created by a movie, not the kind that disappears when the lights come on, a different kind. The kind that changes daily habits, the kind that follows people home, the kind that makes ordinary routines feel different. To understand why the Night Stalker case remains so memorable decades later, you have to understand what happened beyond the investigation itself. Because this story wasn't only about detectives and evidence, it was also about an entire legion living through uncertainty, and uncertainty can be surprisingly powerful. By the summer of 1985, Southern California was experiencing something unusual. Millions of people were following the same story simultaneously. Every news update mattered, every development became a conversation. Every new piece of information spread rapidly through neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools. People discussed the case constantly. Parents discussed it, neighbors discussed it, coworkers discussed it. The investigation became part of daily life. And when a criminal investigation becomes part of daily life, its impact extends far beyond law enforcement. The psychological effects begin appearing everywhere. One of the most interesting aspects of the Night Stalker case is how dramatically public behavior changed. Many residents who had never thought twice about home security suddenly became extremely cautious. Doors were checked repeatedly, windows were inspected before bed, outdoor lighting became more important, alarm systems became more common, neighbor watch groups expanded rapidly. Some communities organized meetings specifically to discuss safety concerns, others distributed information among residents. What makes this particularly remarkable is that most people would never personally encounter the offender, yet the possibility alone was enough to influence behavior. That's the power of uncertainty. Human beings are naturally uncomfortable risks they cannot predict. And during 1985, unpredictability had become one of the defining characteristics of the investigation. People wanted rules. They wanted certainty. They wanted to know who might be affected. But the case offered very few simple answers. That reality created a level of public concern that continued growing as media coverage expanded. Television played a major role. It's difficult to appreciate today just how influential local news broadcasts were during the 1980s, before smartphones, before social media, before instant notifications. Television served as the primary source of information for millions of people. Every evening, viewers tuned in for updates, and during the Night Stalker investigation, those updates attracted enormous audiences. Families gathered around televisions waiting for new information, waiting for breakthroughs, waiting for reassurance, waiting for answers. Sometimes answers arrived, sometimes they didn't, but the attention never disappeared. Meanwhile, journalists face their own challenges. How do you inform the public without increasing panic? How do you provide necessary information without encouraging rumors? How do you cover a major investigation responsibly while maintaining audience interest? Those questions remain relevant today, and the Night Stalker case became one of the most frequently discussed examples. Some critics argued media coverage intensified fear, others argued it helped keep communities informed and alert. Both perspectives contained truth. Public awareness ultimately played an important role in the outcome of the case, but public awareness also contributed to widespread anxiety. The balance was complicated, and there were no easy answers. Yet, perhaps the most significant impact occurred at the community level. People who barely knew their neighbors suddenly introduced themselves. Residents exchanged phone numbers. Communities organized meetings. Families checked on elderly relatives more frequently. People paid attention to one another in ways they hadn't before. Fear can divide communities, but sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it creates cooperation. And in many parts of Southern California, that's exactly what happened. The Night Stalker investigation became a shared experience, a challenge faced collectively rather than individually. That sense of collective urgency would later play an important role when the suspect's identity became public. But even before the capture, communities had already changed. The investigation had altered how people interacted with their surroundings, how they thought about safety, how they viewed vulnerability. Those changes didn't disappear overnight. Years later, many residents still remember specific routines they adopted during that period. Some continued them permanently. That's one of the fascinating aspects of high profile criminal investigations. The events themselves may eventually end, but the habits they create can survive much longer. The Night Stalker case also influenced law enforcement strategies. Agencies increasingly recognized the importance of cooperation across jurisdictions. Information sharing became a larger priority. Communication methods improved. Future investigations would benefit from lessons learned during this period. In that sense, the case helped shape how major investigations were approached in later years. Another lasting impact involved public expectations. By the late 1980s, people expected more communication from law enforcement during major investigations. They expected updates, transparency, information. The relationship between investigators, media, and communities was evolving. Cases like the Night Stalker investigation accelerated that evolution. Looking back now, it's easy to focus entirely on the criminal aspects of the story, the evidence, the arrest, the trial. For doing so overlooks something important: the millions of ordinary people who lived through it. People who watched the news every night, people who worried about loved ones, people who changed routines and adapted to uncertainty. Their experiences are part of the story too, because the Night Stalker case wasn't simply an investigation, it was a social event, a cultural event, a moment that affected an entire region simultaneously. And perhaps that's why it remains so memorable, not because of a single headline, not because of a single arrest, but because for one extraordinary period of time, Southern California shared the same question: who was responsible? The answer eventually arrived. The fear eventually faded. The headlines eventually stopped. But the memory remained, and decades later, people still remember what it felt like when an entire city waited for answers together. Most people know the headline version of the Night Stalker story. A serial offender terrorizes Southern California. Investigators launch a massive manhunt. A suspect is identified. The public helps bring the case to an end. It's a story that sounds almost cinematic, but beneath the headlines lies another story. A story made up of overlooked details, unexpected coincidences, investigative decisions, and small moments that rarely make it into documentaries. And in many ways, those details are what make this case so fascinating decades later. Because when researchers revisit the Night Stalker investigation today, they often discover that some of the most important parts of the story were never the most famous. One example involves timing. Looking back, people often assume investigators immediately recognized they were dealing with a serial offender. In reality, things were much more complicated. Large metropolitan regions generate enormous amounts of investigative every day. Detectives constantly review reports, compare evidence, and evaluate potential connections. Patterns that seem obvious in hindsight are often much harder to recognize in real time. The Night Stalker investigation reminds us of that reality. What appears clear after an arrest can appear confusing while events are still unfolding. This is one reason historians continue studying the case. It demonstrates how investigations actually work, not as perfect sequences of breakthroughs, but as processes filled with uncertainty. Another often overlooked detail involves communication. Today, information moves instantly. Investigators can share digital records in seconds. Databases can be accessed immediately. Photographs can reach millions of people through social media within minutes. The Night Stalker case occurred during a very different era. Information moved more slowly. Records required additional coordination. Communication depended heavily on physical documentation, phone calls, and interagency cooperation. Many younger viewers watching documentaries today underestimate how much this affected investigations. The technological limitations of the 1980s created challenges that modern investigators rarely face, and yet, despite those limitations, detectives eventually succeeded. That achievement remains one of the most impressive aspects of the case. Then there is the role of ordinary citizens. People often remember that members of the public helped identify Ramirez after his image became widely distributed. What receives less attention is the broader lesson. Major investigations frequently rely on public participation, not because investigators cannot solve cases independently, but because communities possess information investigators may never encounter otherwise. Witnesses notice details. Neighbors remember conversations. People recognize faces. The Night Stalker case became a powerful demonstration of that principle. Public awareness didn't replace detective work, it amplified it. The two worked together, and that partnership ultimately became one of the defining features of the investigation. Another fascinating aspect involves media influence. Few criminal cases arrived at exactly the moment television news was becoming increasingly influential in American culture. The Night Stalker investigation unfolded during a period when local news broadcasts attracted enormous audiences. Every update reached millions, every development generated discussion. Researchers still debate how much media coverage influenced public perception. Some argue it increased fear, others argue it improved awareness. Most likely, both effects occur simultaneously. The case became an early example of how media and criminal investigations can shape one another, and that relationship remains relevant today. Then there is a question that continues attracting attention from criminologists and psychologists. Why does the Night Stalker case remain so memorable compared to many other investigations from the same era? Part of the answer involves unpredictability. Human beings are naturally uncomfortable with uncertainty. Most people feel safer when they understand risks, when they can identify patterns, when they can predict outcomes. The Night Stalker investigation challenged those instincts. The offender did not fit neatly into expectations. That unpredictability created unusual psychological impact. And unusual psychological impact often creates lasting public memory. Another reason involves symbolism. Over time, the case became about more than a single investigation. It became a symbol of an era, a symbol of changing media, changing law enforcement practices, changing public awareness. People don't simply remember what happened, they remember what the case represented. That distinction helps explain why documentaries continue occurring decades later. The story functions on multiple levels simultaneously as an investigation, as a historical event, and as a cultural moment. Perhaps one of the most surprising details involves how many future investigations benefited from lessons learned during this case. Law enforcement agencies studied communication challenges, jurisdictional coordination, media relations, evidence management, public notification strategies. Many of the procedures that seem routine today were shaped by experiences gained from investigations like this one. The influence extended far beyond Southern California. In that sense, the Night Stalker case became part of a larger evolution, an evolution in how complex investigations were conducted, how information was shared, and how communities were informed. Yet, despite all the analysis, all the documentaries, and all the books, one aspect remains remarkably consistent. People continue returning to the same central question: how could someone remain unidentified for so long in such a heavily populated region? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because investigations are rarely as straightforward as they appear afterward. Evidence must be verified, assumptions must be tested, mistakes must be avoided. Every major decision carries consequences. The patience required can be frustrating, but it is often necessary. The Night Stalker investigation illustrates this perfectly. What appears to be a dramatic story of pursuit was also a story of discipline, careful evidence collection, methodical analysis, relentless persistence. Those qualities may not generate dramatic headlines, but they solve cases. And perhaps that's the most important lesson hidden inside the entire story. Not that the investigation was extraordinary, but that success ultimately depended on ordinary principles applied consistently: evidence, cooperation, patience, persistence. The public remembers the headlines. Investigators remember the process. And decades later, both perspectives continue shaping how the Night Stalker case is remembered. Because some stories survive not simply because they are shocking, but because they reveal something important about how truth is discovered, one piece of evidence at a time. Every major criminal case leaves something behind. Sometimes it's a court record, sometimes it's a headline, sometimes it's a memory that slowly fades with time. But occasionally, a case leaves a much larger footprint. The Night Stalker investigation became one of those cases. Not because it was the biggest investigation in American history, not because it was the longest, and not because it involved the most famous offender. It became significant because it changed people, it changed communities, it changed investigative practices, and in many ways, it changed how the public thought about crime itself. Looking back today, decades after the events of 1985, it would be easy to focus only on the most dramatic moments. The manhunt, the arrest, the trial, the headlines, those moments are important, but they are not the entire story. The full story is much larger. Because when historians revisit the Night Stalker case, they don't simply study one individual, they study an entire period in American history, a period when technology was changing, media was changing, law enforcement was changing, and public awareness was changing with it. The investigation arrived at a unique moment. Television connected communities in ways previous generations had never experienced. News spread quickly, information reached millions. For the first time, entire regions could follow a developing investigation almost in real time. That reality transformed the relationship between the public and criminal investigations. People were no longer passive observers, they became participants, witnesses, information sources, community partners. The Night Stalker case demonstrated how powerful that partnership could become. But perhaps the most important legacy involves something else entirely: the victims. In many famous criminal cases, public attention eventually becomes concentrated on the offender. Books are written, documentaries are produced, photographs become recognizable, names become familiar. Yet the people most affected by these events often receive the least attention. That imbalance has become a major topic of discussion among modern historians and documentary filmmakers. Increasingly, researchers argue that the most meaningful way to understand cases like the Night Stalker investigation is through the experiences of those impacted by it. The families, the survivors, the communities. Their stories reveal consequences that statistics never can. Their experiences explain why these investigations matter, and their resilience often becomes the most important part of the narrative. The Night Stalker case also left a professional legacy. Investigators across the United States studied it carefully. Law enforcement agencies examined what worked, they examined what didn't. Communication strategies evolved, information sharing improved, multi agency cooperation received greater attention. Many lessons learned during this investigation influenced future approaches to complex criminal cases. Those lessons continue shaping investigative work even today. Another lasting impact involves public awareness. People often assume awareness is a passive thing, something that simply happens. But the Night Stalker investigation demonstrated that awareness can be active. Communities can share information, citizens can pay attention, neighborhoods can cooperate, individuals can contribute positively during difficult circumstances. That lesson remains relevant decades later in an era of instant communication and social media. The importance of responsible public awareness has only increased. Yet, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Night Stalker legacy is psychological. Why does this story still attract attention? Why do documentaries continue appearing? Why do new generations continue discovering the case? The answer isn't necessarily found in the investigation itself. It's found in the questions the story raises. questions about fear, questions about uncertainty, questions about how communities respond during periods of anxiety. Those themes are universal. Every generation understands them, every generation relates to them. That's why the story continues surviving long after the headlines disappear. It isn't just about 1985, it's about human nature. It's about how people react when certainty disappears. It's about how communities respond when challenges arise. And perhaps most importantly, it's about what happens when people work together to overcome those challenges. The Night Stalker investigation began with uncertainty. A region searching for answers, investigators searching for connections, communities searching for reassurance. For a time, it seemed as though the questions might continue indefinitely, but eventually the answers arrived. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece, evidence by evidence, decision by decision, the same way most important truths are discovered. That's one reason the case remains such a valuable study for investigators today. It reinforces a simple lesson. Extraordinary outcomes are often produced by ordinary persistence, not luck, more coincidence, persistence, people doing their jobs carefully, communities paying attention, evidence being followed wherever it leads. Those principles solved the case then, and they continue solving cases now. As the years passed, Southern California moved forward. The headlines faded. New stories emerged. New investigations captured public attention. Life returned to normal. But history never completely disappears. It remains preserved in records, photographs, court documents, news footage, and memories. The Night Stalker case became part of that history, a reminder of a period when an entire region searched for answers together, a reminder of the challenges investigators faced, a reminder of the importance of community awareness, and a reminder that even during periods of uncertainty, persistence matters. Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all, because long after the fear faded, long after the trial ended, and long after the headlines stopped printing, the real story remained. A story about investigation, a story about resilience, and a story about how truth eventually emerged from uncertainty. One clue at a time, one decision at a time, until the mystery finally came to an end.